This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, this is the Stephen Coughlin Moment brought to you by the Glazov Gang. Continuing from the last Stephen Coughlin Moment, we'll call this Part 2. The War on Terror narrative was set within a month of 9/11, the reporter's Rolodex. Lurking in the background of all this, I'd like you to remember that there is the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism narrative. But first, a brief review. Of course, last week, as noted, I stated that the objective of the enemy in the war on terror is the non-kinetic victory through subversion of the doctrinal template through systematic control of its inputs at all levels. Well, of course, I know that in real language what that means is the object of the enemy in the war on terror is to control decision-making by controlling what the decision-makers think they know about the issues that supports the decision they're going to make by controlling the inputs to that decision. It's just this simple. You cannot have a strategy to defeat an enemy you will not identify or define. And the enemy plans on winning this war by keeping us always coming up with abstract models of the enemy instead of the enemy himself, and therefore always shooting into the null set domain of nothingness. Hence Sun Tzu's warning to know the enemy. It's in this context that we also brought up Sun Tzu's adage, which I'm hoping is starting to make sense. The tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. We can win every battle over there, but if we can't have a strategy, and we don't have one if we won't define the enemy, all we're doing is huffing and puffing before someone blows our house down. And we use the infamous quote from Carlos de Jackal that only a coalition of Marxists and Islamists can destroy the United States. In that discussion, we focused on Louis Safi. He's the man who was executive director of the International Institute of Islamic Thought, the IIIT, when he wrote this book published by the IIIT, Peace and the Limits of War. This was published within a month of 9/11 that set the criteria that made it impossible for us to define the enemy without being accused of validating the enemy. The other player we talked about was the Society of Professional Journalists, the SPJ. They published our diversity guidelines, and we went through those diversity guidelines on how to report on the war. They provided, of course, their rules for proper reporting of a story. This part 2, as we'll continue, will focus on the SPJ, showing how its guidelines link up with the narrative set by the Muslim Brotherhood. So, as we look at the diversity guidelines and remember that they had these rules for reporting, remember one of those rules was to ask men and women from within the targeted communities to review your coverage and make suggestions. That is to say, you have a report on organized crime, and you go to Don Corleone to help him validate what you're saying, because he comes from the Italian community. If you're talking about the mafia, the Italian mafia, well, they might not really want you to report on what you know. And if you subordinate your reporting to what Don Corleone says is appropriate, guess what? You're going to miss the whole thing. We're basically going to point out here that that's what this is all about. And it creates a de facto form of prior restraint, the worst form of restraint on the First Amendment. Because as we'll also show, the goal is to make this the national norm, the official norm for reporting. And finally, remember, we talked about the 5 Maynard rules, or as they were called, the 5 Maynard fault lines. Remember, we're supposed to go to the Maynard Institute for Journalism and Education to find out what those fault lines, and what we found was that almost all their fault lines on reporting had to do with, guess what? Maintaining the priority of diversity requirements over the actual reporting on the fact of the matter. So after we got through this, and now we'll continue and we'll move on from what we already have just reviewed, following from seeking out the Maynard guidelines, it then takes us to a link in these guidelines from the Society of Professional Journalists, the SPJ, to an entity called Newswatch. And there's a link to the Newswatch website from there. And what is Newswatch? It's a site, reading it right off their report, dedicated to diversity in journalism. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that this is also an entity that seeks reporting based on diversity interests. And like the SPJ, as we looked at their website, Newswatch's evaluation criteria on news reporting is based strictly on conformist diversity interests. The story behind the news, as I like to say, is that there actually is no news, and that whatever facts there are, they are to be strictly subordinated to the postmodern multicultural narrative, which exists to actually push out the fact of the matter. So as we look at the Newswatch webpage, right there in the middle of it is a big old tab, and it says Media Guide to Islam. So we click on that Media Guide to Islam, and what do we find on our introduction page? Well, let me read it. Welcome to the Media Guide to Islam, a journalist guide to covering Islam. This site is developed for journalists by journalists with the aim of helping ensure accuracy when covering Islam and Muslims in the United States. The first thing I'd like to point out is this was not written by people who actually are saying they know what they're talking about, by an entity that basically says that diversity guidelines take priority anyhow. But it goes on and it says, this site is intended for journalists looking for a primer on Islam and Muslims living in the US. Each section provides straightforward information for anyone on a deadline. So what are they telling you here? This is the site to go to for a data dump on information about Islam for the reporter who knows that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Going to Newswatch to get information written by journalists who know nothing about Islam for their information requirements on Islam. Yes, this is the diversity narrative. And it's also the null set narrative where there's no information, which for them is good information. As we continue through this media guide to Islam, it takes us to a location, Islam in the United States. And in there, it has a resource tab. And if we click on the resource tab, it takes us to, and this is why we have the title, the Reporter's Rolodex. That's right, a list of names that are provided in this media guide to Islam on who you can talk to provide really good information about Islam. And very heavily represented on this list are members known to be associated with the Muslim Brotherhood or as Muslim Brotherhood front groups in the United States. Let me give you an example from this list. And of course, this is from 2001. Ihsan Bagbi, who was associated with the Islamic Society in North America, ISNA, and the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, and MANA. Zahid Bukhari, ICNA, Islamic Circle of North America. Ibrahim Hooper, CARE. Ataf Hussein, ISNA, the Muslim Student Association, the MSA, the original Muslim Brotherhood entity in the United States, and again MANA. Sherman Jackson, the Fiqh Council of North America, which in the 1990s was still called the ISNA Fiqh Committee, but changed its name. Sherman Jackson is also affiliated with the North American Islamic Trust, or he was at the time this document was written. Then there's Muqtadar Khan. He is affiliated with the IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, and the Association of Muslim Social Scientists of North America. Ingrid Mattson with ISNA. At the time, she was the vice president of ISNA, and she became the president of ISNA. ISNA, Islamic Society in North America, is the lead Muslim Brotherhood entity in the United States. And finally, we have Siraj Wahaj. He's affiliated with ISNA, CARE, NATE, North American Islamic Trust, and MANA. Incidentally, he is also an unindicted co-conspirator in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So as we take a look at the Society of Professional Journalists lead provider of information, Newswatch, where they take us to its media guide to Islam, we're taking to the Reporter's Rolodex, and then we're taking to a list of names who are known Muslim Brotherhood front groups. So the SPJ does link up to the Muslim Brotherhood after all. Go figure. Going all the way back to 9/11, Carlos de Jackal's admonition begins to take on real meaning, that only a coalition of Marxists and Islamists can destroy the United States. This is not theoretical. In fact, it's not theoretical at all. As we look at the drivers of the news used to inform Americans about the war on terror, the old Soviet joke about the news takes on real form for Americans today. Of course, the Russian word for news is izvestia, and the Russian word for truth is pravda. And the Russian joke was, in the news there is no truth, and in the truth there is no news. And that is the state of reporting for Americans in the war on terror today. Truly, Orwell's 2 + 2 = 5 has become the standard. I'd like to end this discussion with a quote from a German philosopher, Joseph Pieper, on the state of affairs when the truth is no longer a part of the daily discourse. From Joseph Pieper's Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. It is entirely possible that the true and authentic reality is being drowned out in propaganda fashion. The place of authentic reality is taken over by fictitious reality. My perception is indeed still directed toward an object, but now it is a pseudo-reality, deceptively appearing as being real, so much so that it becomes almost impossible anymore to discern the truth. It is my fear that that's where we are today. As we look at the SPHA's narrative and how it links up with the Muslim Brotherhood, I would like to point out that this has become institutionalized in our government institutions through the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism narrative, as will be discussed in a future discussion. Thank you very much. Please support Jamie Glazov at jamieglazov.com and make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel.